as part of the Drones and AI budget-friendly turnkey solution course and workshops, we want to look specifically at case studies, how drones are being used for conservation purposes, both land-based and also sea-based. And I am absolutely delighted that I managed to be able to secure Dr. Amy Macleod for this session. You work in the Galapagos Islands with the marine iguanas there. They have recently been featured as part of both the BBC's program, Planet Earth, and also very recently, actually, on ITV in the UK, Pacific Islands, the Galapagos Islands with Martin Clunes. There was a little bit a segment there about the use of drones. That was land-based conservation. But I think the work you're doing out there is amazing. And with that said, I really want to hand over to you, Amy, to give us a little bit of an idea. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and how you really got into the iguana research and your passion for these amazing and very unique animals?
So originally I'm trained as a zoologist, and my interests in that area are pretty broad. I worked on like amphibians, marine mammals, birds. So I guess I'm like motivated by the conservation concern, and I'm pretty open to different approaches and which kind of category of wildlife I work on. And when I was looking for a PhD, having worked on toads on my master's and marine mammals as well, I ended up getting offered this project to work on the marine iguana. So I didn't know a huge amount about the marine iguana. I was familiar with them, but like if you're offered an opportunity to work on the Galapagos, then of course you're going to say yes. So I started to work on the marine iguana, and very quickly it became quite apparent to me that this is a species that's somehow oddly been overlooked, in my opinion. So they're very famous, and yet there's so many basic things we still don't really know about them, like their kind of movement ecology, do they migrate, when do they move, and the very basic question of just how many are there isn't still really known, actually. And so as a conservationist, obviously that's alarming, because they are a red listed endangered species. They're only found on the Galapagos, nowhere else on Earth. They've never been successfully kept in captivity, so they obviously need to be protected there. And in order to protect a species, you need that baseline data of like, well, how many are there and where do I find them? And on top of that was the taxonomic question of, okay, but is this one species? Are these many subspecies? Are there actually species within this group of organisms? Because obviously the Galapagos is very famous for speciation, and most of the time, if you've got an organism occurring on all of these different islands, it's going to be different species, because these are quite separate places with their own environments and different adaptive challenges. And the situation with the marine iguana was kind of messy. Like there were some subspecies described, but they didn't really fit with the early genetic information that we had. And there were certain islands where there were marine iguanas, but there were no subspecies described. It wasn't really clear where they fit into the picture, so it was all a bit of a mess. And I think ironically the lack of data on it was making it more difficult for people to actually start to do anything. So instead of trying, people just moved along and like did a more obvious thing. I don't know, but that was my feeling. And so that's what we kind of set out to do was, we started out with a question of like, there seemed to be some case of speciation on one island, and with genetic methods, we were exploring that. And in the end, like it became really apparent that this whole taxonomy needed revising. So we did that. And so now there's like a clearer taxonomy that's based on morphology and genetics. And then the next thing to come is, okay, well, now we know what the important units are, that we basically have a subspecies per island in most situations, which you need to know first. And each of them are different and are necessary for the survival of the species. So they need to be kind of conserved as units and not just the species as a whole, but it's important that each of these units that contributes to the species and gives them their like adaptive strength over time, which is very important for them. And it's important that these be conserved, but then we need to know, okay, well, how many are there and which ones are the real concerns here? Like which ones are much smaller and where are the threats? So that's kind of what we're coming to now. And it came kind of to the end of my PhD, and I'd focused very much on one island, and we got a lot of work done there. And we knew a lot about the conservation situation there, but there's the rest of the archipelago. And towards the end of the PhD, I remember giving like a sort of seminar at the university, and I was just complaining about the fact that we probably never have an answer to this question of how many are there, because logistically it was basically impossible. Like it's very expensive to hire boats on the Galapagos, like something like €1,000 a day for a liveaboard, or like $500 a day for a fishing boat, and still then you can't get to many places. So if you want to survey this species and do walking surveys across the whole archipelago, it's going to be incredibly expensive. It's going to take you a lot of time. And there's also the problem that most places are just inaccessible because it's really hard to get there. Like you're dealing with really high waves, they smash against the coast, there's sharp, slippy lava rocks. And the way you get onto them is you just literally half the time jumping off a moving boat with the waves and hoping you land well on the lava rocks. You know, it's really, really dangerous, and there are lots of accidents, and like I have scars from them too. So even if you could have the money and the time to do it, like there's lots of places that are really dangerous to get to, and there's others that are just impossible, like you just won't get there. And so it just seemed like hopeless. And then a postdoc at the seminar said, well, what about drones? And I was like, that's an interesting thought. And this was back in 2015, and at that time drones were,
just
nowhere
about
near
to come. And most people, and I remember back then, 2014, 15, when I done my first drones, I actually got a video somewhere on my YouTube page about a wood drone. I literally built a drone out of balsa wood, stick 4 engines in it, a sandwich box with a flight controller, and build all this kind of stuff. And when you look where we are now in 2022 and how far drones have come with the built-in telemetry, 4K camera, long battery life, a lot of these technology innovations actually were driven by, one thing everyone's got, the smartphone, because you got a gyroscope in there, you got a small high definition camera, you got a compass sensor in there, you got all sorts of additional technology built in. So smartphone technology in a way opened up the horizon to use these drones. You then had the idea, okay, someone suggested, have you looked into the use of drones? And then you started looking into this. And I guess your project Iguanas from Above was born. And I'm just bringing up the website so people can see what this is about. Can you tell us a little bit more about the project, your thinking behind, maybe it was a team behind it, and how you deploy these drones then?
Yeah, so from the initial idea in 2015, it took a while for the technology to develop, and for us, another big obstacle for us would be getting the permission to use this kind of novel, potentially risky approach in somewhere like the Galapagos, which is an incredibly well-protected place. And we weren't sure whether anybody would really allow it. So we were kind of lucky that there was a few teams getting on board with drone technology to answer various questions. And so the authorities start to see the use of these approaches and luckily allowed it. So we actually really started in sort of mid 2020 with getting on board with this, and it was a big learning curve because none of us were drone pilots at that time. We were just people interested in conservation that wanted to approach it in a different way. And so I started with a student, she's now a PhD student, Andrea Varela, she's Ecuadorian. And we had the good connection with a professor from an Ecuadorian university, Gonzalo Rivas Torres, who has been using drones for more like sort of vegetation mapping, so terrestrial uses, but we have the special challenge that we want to do it from boats. Which is a whole new set of challenges. I mean, there's all the questions of how good are your camera, etc., but we actually want to launch it from like these small boats, which is really, I think, pushing the boundaries still a little bit, like in some of the conditions that we're flying in. Yes, so you see also there is Sebastian Steinfurt. So he was my PhD supervisor. Now he's the collaborator. He's had a long interest in the marine iguana. And so he is the professor at Leipzig and supports the project and kind of gave some seed funding to get it started, because something we struggled with really a lot in the beginning was because it was so novel and untested, people didn't really want to give us money to do it, because we couldn't prove it would work, and it was an experiment, and they, for conservation, there are limited funds and nobody wants to fund expensive experiments, really. It's not, and it's, you know, it was like too applied, too conservation based for scientific funding, and then it was maybe too technological and risky for conservation funding. Yeah. So in the video you see, here we are. This was actually our first field season. So that's Andrea and I in the boat, and we're flying the drone, which is a Mavic Pro 2, from the small boats and approaching the coastline. This is actually a really nice lagoon on San Cristobal, where we saw a lot of really cool rays and sharks. And this clip is Santa Fe, and you can see the terrain we're dealing with there. Like,
it
how
looks
do you
very
access,
treacherous and very,
you know,
very
how do you
dangerous,
access
actually.
that? Like, you don't. Oh, and here you can see a bit of the rays. So it's really good for getting into mangroves. They're very difficult to approach otherwise. And you know, it was amazing to see this perspective on the place that I already knew quite well as well. So we fly the drones over the coastline. Normally we're flying and facing directly down with the camera like this. We capture photographs, and we kind of often fly in a zigzag with an overlap. And then and then we'll stitch those photographs together into like a mosaic or an ortho photo, and then we'll cut them up for counting if we're doing it on Zooniverse, for instance. Otherwise we might just count from the ortho photo if it's us that's doing it. So we're flying the drones ideally from the boat, and we land them on the boat as well, which, like in this situation, you see is very calm sea. It's not usual. Actually, sometimes we're really dealing with a lot of swell and waves and wind, and it gets very exciting, to say the least. And so we're hand launching them and we're hand catching them, and we have to really train for that. So we just had our most ambitious field season about 2 months ago now, where we went to all of the really far away islands. So in the far north, we went to Darwin and Wolf, which is so remote that it's not usually even on the map of the Galapagos. It was a 14-hour boat journey from already quite far north in the islands. And up there, the sea conditions are pretty wild. And we were flying the drones. We wanted to have 2 drone teams because boat time's very expensive. We wanted to maximize drone time there, so we had a team of 6. We got a really good drone pilot. He's also like a nature photographer, so that was awesome to have somebody who was really comfortable, and he's had experience with flying drones to monitor rays, so he was really good to have on the team. And then we had Andrea, who's our other drone pilot. So we were flying 2 drone teams in parallel, one from a sailing boat and one from a dinghy. And a sailing boat in itself was a challenge because it had all of these wires and ropes and things. And that would be fine if the sea was flat, you would just go around them. But you're dealing with swells and a boat turning and wind, and you're trying to land and launch the drone so it doesn't hit any of these things. So there's like real logistical stuff, and also the point of a moving home point, you know, like a drone, if it panics, if it loses connection to the remote, will try to go to the home point.
It
But
ends
the
up in
home
the
point,
water if the boat moves, right?
yeah, and we often are following the drone with the boat. So when we fly from a dinghy, we send the drone and we're scanning down the coast with the drone, and we follow with the dinghy. So we cover the most coastline that way. And if the drone tries to return to the home point, it lands in the sea. And that did happen more than once. And losing drones is kind of a thing that we know is going to happen. But the thing is, we need to try to recover it, because we don't want to leave the drones in the sea with the lithium batteries and all of that. So each time we have managed to recover them, but those are always the most tense moments. But still, we're getting to places that you just couldn't get otherwise. And the risk here is losing a drone instead of having a person swept out to sea or smashed on the rocks. So, you know, these are real, I'm not being dramatic, like these are real things that happen out there. And on this expedition, we had another student on the from a sort of parallel project that was collecting samples, and we had to go to land occasionally, and we had these scenarios, and it just was a real reminder for me, like, why we're trying to develop this method of using the drones, because it's just safer. It's safer for the people, but it's also safer for the islands. If we can avoid getting on those islands, there's no risk of us bringing accidentally a small ant or a seed or something. You know, invasive species is a huge risk, and these islands are really pristine. And of course we take the correct precautions, but it's never 100%. And the only way for it to be 100% is to just not go there. So we're doing this in a very non-invasive way. We're not going there. We're just going there visually, kind of. And one other thing I find very cool is that we can kind of take other people there online, because we have, for instance, our Zooniverse volunteers who they're almost like, you know, it's not like visiting the island, but it's an eye on the island in a really detailed way that they can access from the safety of their house. And it's really accessible. Like, you know, for instance, during COVID times, we had a lot of volunteers who perhaps would otherwise like to have gone and done, you know, well, it was like in the field conservation work, but they couldn't. So what they could do was work with us, and we really appreciate the help, and it was a kind of win-win. And we've had other people who have, for instance, illnesses or physical disabilities that preclude them from traditional conservation work, and they've been able to help us and make a real contribution. And I think that's awesome that it's sort of inclusive for all kinds of people, and very useful for us. So
this is also what I found amazing, and thank you for giving us this sort of feel what it's like on the ground. I mean, I fly drones myself. I've got a local nature reserve. I work on a little conservation project. We've got a bird sanctuary there, and birds need breeding ground. But there's a spread of New Zealand pygmy beet, Crashley hemsley. That used to be a pond plant in the UK, and also aquarium plant. I think it's been banned now since 2014. But the problem is, as you just mentioned, invasive species, once they're out in the nature and they meet the right conditions, and bearing in mind the lake not far away from me, it's got very clayey soil. There's a lot of nutrients in there. It grows really, really fast. And I've worked with the local park rangers here to use artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. I'm doing exactly what you're doing. I send the drone up, I take straight down vertical pictures, I build a autographic 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional model in different applications. The one I use, because it's cheap, works pretty well, is WebODM, which is called Web Open Drone Map, and I'm happy to share more details with you on that. And what you then can do is you can deploy different AI algorithms to the pictures that colors the pictures in depending on what it thinks it sees. There's a very brief segment in the Martin Clunes documentary about the Galapagos Islands, where it's talking about, I think it's Galicia, forests and the invasive growth of black bears that a farmer brought in back in the 50s, and they have spread, and not only just on one island, also they have traveled to the other islands, and there's a real challenge here now locally to get rid of that. So that's very, very important. The Zooniverse project you mentioned earlier on, which is, I guess, a combination of innovative crowdsourcing and citizen science. Your project is up on there. I think it's been up since a couple of days again, the second tranche. And I signed up. I done a little bit of classification to get a better understanding of what people need to do. But you can probably walk me through here. So this is one of the pictures that the tool presents to people, the pictures you took, the aerial photography. And then there, I suppose, you can walk me through here as I go on here, because these pictures are a little bit bigger and they are marked up, because it's actually quite challenging once you look at these pictures. Some of these iguanas are actually very well fitting into their natural environment. And, you know, you can zoom, you can look closely, but I found it quite challenging to marking these up on the screen. And hence you need a lot of eyes on the ground. Now, you can't expect 2,000 people to fly out to the Galapagos Islands with a clipboard and pen and paper and just start counting. So the only way this is really achievable is by harvesting data through the drones, making this data available through a platform like Zooniverse, and then tapping into, lucky enough, in this case, human intelligence, to ask students, people, whoever wants to participate in your project, to identify those. So I think you've done the first tranche of this last year. Second one just started, and I would encourage everyone who's watching this to please sign yourself up with Help Amy and the team there and the iguanas, because this looks like it's a long-term project that needs increased attention by a lot of people. So go on there, Help Amy, but you can probably walk me a little bit through how this works, your experiences from the first tranches, and also maybe in future how you're thinking you could augment some of this research with machine learning and deploying some AI.
Yeah. Okay. So first, I'll just talk about how these images were created. Sure. We're flying the drones from the boats. We take the photographs. We do often flying with a zigzag pattern with a large overlap between the images that allows us to stitch them together to create these mosaics and ortho photos. And then we slice those down to sort of to force the volunteers basically to look at a detailed angle, because the full photographs you really have to zoom in to see the iguanas. So we kind of do the zooming in for them, let's say, and we present the images at this kind of level already. And it's still a bit hard sometimes to get the scale for the volunteers. And there's not a huge amount we can do about that, but we have like this quite detailed tutorial to explain workarounds for that kind of thing. So it's all explained there. So we have these images. We're doing it in different phases, because ultimately we are going to survey the entire archipelago, anywhere where we suspect the iguanas to be found. We did originally want to do the entire coastline, but turns out that is way too optimistic. So we are focusing on it, but it's still a much better coverage than we've ever had before for this species. So we're taking the images in phases, and this is our second phase of Zooniverse. The first was quite experimental. We were just kind of throwing everything out there and seeing what the volunteers could work with and what not. And we got some really good feedback from that first one, and we've learned a lot. And so we're now in the second round. And the idea is each round we develop and learn better. And ultimately, we've hopefully sort of honed this crowdsourcing of the iguana data. But of course, it is challenging, and the volunteers are going to miss some of them, and we would miss some of them as well. And that is just a natural part of counting animals. It is never, ever perfect. And you get as close to perfect as you can, but you have to accept that, animals are difficult to count because they move and they hide and they camouflage with their environment. And that is, so alongside the counts that we get from the volunteers, we're also doing counts in the field to ground truth this and see how realistic it is. And we do it against the kind of gold standard of mark recapture, which is, you know, it's quite an involved method. We can only do it in a few places, but it will give us an idea of how much we're missing. So we might be able to, once we've figured it all out, like kind of apply a correction factor and say, okay, well, we counted 7,000 iguanas here, but actually we should add 30% for the probability, the ones we missed. And it's one way of approaching that question. And also to mention that the volunteers are really sweet and they try really hard, and like that's wonderful. But we also show each photo to say at least 20 different times, so that we're looking on aggregate for an average, and we don't expect every count to be perfect. So it's not all the pressure is on, you know, one person. We really appreciate that people try so hard, but of course nobody's going to be perfect, and we're just seeing how close we can get with this and how this works. So it's a bit of an experiment. I mean, hearing about Zooniverse is an amazing platform. Like I go on there sometimes and I'm just like, oh, I'm just going to help with this whale sound project. And the other day I was transcribing records from an orphanage in the 18th century. They're so varied, and it's really cool to see what's out there and to contribute from your house. So I do really recommend everyone check out Zooniverse. Obviously, I'd love them to help with our project, but there's also so many other worthy things out there. And it originally started from astronomical research, like looking into deep space and
Objects
using people
on the sky. Yeah,
it was really interesting. And when I first had the idea of the drone research, I also initially did want people to help us, because I thought, well, I'd seen in my department people like scientists who have studied for years and years and years and are really qualified and should be working on, you know, challenging scientific stuff, spending hours and hours and hours like looking at computer images that didn't really take a lot of skill. And I thought, this just doesn't seem like a good use of time. And I would imagine there are lay people out there who would happily volunteer to do these kind of tasks that don't require decades of training. And then the scientists could be, you know, furthering their projects and people contributing. So I wanted there to be something like that. And then coincidentally, I heard about Zooniverse through a talk in Berlin. And I thought, okay, well, it exists. And now I really have to get the drones. So the citizen science aspect and the drones for me kind of came together even in the initial idea. So it was like really cool to find that something like Zooniverse already existed, and they have a project builder and they make it really, really easy to put projects on there. So I was really happy with Zooniverse as well. And it's been really nice to work with human volunteers who are engaged and ask questions, and we chat with them on the message boards. And it's quite nice if you're somebody who spends a lot of time with machines and you're typing things in and you get your answers, but there's no human contact. And I've really enjoyed it, actually.
I guess, I mean, let's come back to this in a minute, because you are also actually looking and asking volunteers, not just to identify iguanas, and you're going further, you're asking if people could identify whether they are male with a leg, or whether they are alone, or if there are also juveniles, females, so they all gather together, and sometimes partial ones. So sometimes in some pictures you only can see the long tail coming from a corner, and you ask people to identify that. But you going further, you also want to people to mark up whether they recognize some birds, some algae, some other plant growth, and we can see here some sea lions. I've had a couple of pictures with no iguanas, but an awful lot of red crabs on there, which are, I think, another species that the Galapagos Islands are very famous for. So we can see a few here. What I wanted to ask you is, and when I did this classification work, and I will get back to it because I want to support what you're doing here and you know, learning more, but I guess it puts me in the space without being there, which is lovely. And I do a lot of aerial photography, videography. I've done quite a bit during the pandemic, actually, for my local community here, because people couldn't go out when they wanted to. There were restrictions, but I went out, done the footage, put it on YouTube, shared it through some Facebook channels and local communities, and they were really receptive of that, because you kind of opening up the world. You sort of moving beyond now, I guess, Planet Earth BBC, the kind of work that Martin Clunes did and others. You're showing how it really is on the ground, and I think that's very important. Also, some of the comments on there, people are pointing out potential plastic waste, other objects that don't know what that is, and they're sharing this with you. So, your attention gets drawn to this, and you might get additional learning coming out of all of this. What I wanted to know from you is, you said it can be quite lonely out there as scientists along these coastlines and on the boat, maybe with a couple of colleagues or just your captain. Your typical day when you're planning these missions, are you planning the mapping missions beforehand on an application like DroneLink, or something else where you can set your waypoints based on a GPS data, Google data? You can map it out. You can calculate already beforehand how long it'll take you to fly off this part of the coast, because you've got to take into account local weather, battery times. You said you're flying with the Mavic Pro 2, I think. So the typical battery time there would be around 30 minutes or so. So you probably got to stash off, I don't know how many batteries on the boat, so you can swap continuously over and just send the drone up when the weather is nice, harvest all that information. What does your typical day collecting all these photos look like? And obviously, also you need to into account, you can't just get out the door of where you're staying and jump on the boat. You have to go on the boat, go out there. So there is a journey to get there, journey to come there. So you need to have all your equipment with you. You can't forget SD cards, because then you say, oh, I can't record anything. And I've done this before. It's silly, but these things happen, so you need to be prepared for all these eventualities when you're using the drones. What are the sort of experiences, both good and bad, and some of the challenges you've come across on your, on the ground work here?
Yeah, so in order to do anything technological on the Galapagos Islands, the first thing you have to know is that if any of your technology is missing or malfunctioning, you will not be able to replace it easily, because it doesn't exist there. It's difficult even in mainland Ecuador sometimes to get replacements for stuff. Like, we had a drone malfunction. We did a training week. Mm-hmm. We went to the coast of Ecuador and just for a week flew the drones from the coastline, from boats, to get everybody on the same page and get skilled up before we went to the islands. And one of the drones failed, and we had to replace it there in Ecuador, and it cost like almost three times the price it would in Europe. And on the islands, like, forget it, it's not happening. So you have to be super prepared, and the preparation for the field season is just me writing endless lists and buying everything I think I need in triple before we go, and still you're going to forget stuff, and each year we learn and we realize, oh, we needed this and this would have been useful, and if we'd only known that existed, sometimes we don't even know stuff is there and could solve our problems. But yeah, we have checklists, because obviously, yeah, you go out in the boat. Sometimes, like the first field season, we were going from one island to another, from San Cristobal to Santa Fe. It's like a 3-hour, very punishing boat ride of just like smacking on the waves. Yeah, it's exhausting. And if you got there and you realized something wasn't working, like, oof, you would be very upset with yourself. So we have physical checklists, and we do those checklists and we double check them, and we have extras of everything we might need that we can afford to have extras of. Sometimes you can't, like you can only afford so much stuff, but I mean, that's all part of it. And each year we're learning. So usually in the first field season, it was going out very early, it's still in the dark, and maximizing your daylight hours, because daylight hours is also a bottleneck. You can only fly these drones in, well, partly the iguanas, being iguanas, don't really get up early. They're not, birds. They only come out when it's warm, which could be nice, but it does minimize the amount of time you're going to have in a day to survey them. And so, yeah, you're trying to maximize those daylight hours. Bottlenecks, or you did mention it, batteries was a big one, because you're in a small boat and you can't charge anything. And in our first field season, we had like one borrowed drone, one bought drone, and a few batteries. And our real bottleneck was, okay, well, now we've run out of batteries, we have to go. So each year buying batteries was a priority, and now we have like a huge number of batteries. And I know DJI are now put out the Mavic 3. Yeah, we do use the 2. I'm very happy with the 2, but we're not going to upgrade because we have all of these batteries now for the 2, which I'm sure won't work in the 3. But yeah, that like figuring out what we really need to invest in and what makes sense was a big part of it. So we go out in the early morning, we fly the drone. If we're in small boats, we usually have a break in the middle of the day because the drones get too hot and we get too hot, and we might go for a little snorkel or something. And then we fly again in the afternoon, and then we're back in the evening. And then in the evening, when we're back in our hotel or wherever we're staying, we often will take a look at the data, make sure it's okay, download from the memory cards, because and another thing we started to do when we lost a drone or 2 was we changed the memory card when we changed the battery. So if a drone does go down, I mean, we've always managed to recover them, but you don't want to lose 8 flights of data your entire day because you couldn't recover the drone. So we change the card every time, and we get these kind of routines that become just ingrained, and we're developing them. And it's been our 3rd field season, and we've made like so much progress. But this time it was like, okay, new challenges. We're flying from even smaller, like tiny rubber dinghies this time, and from a sailing boat. So developing new stuff, and we are constantly, I feel like, on the very boundaries of pushing what's reasonable with this technology. But when it works, it's like hugely satisfying, and it's giving us opportunities that we've never had before. And I think it's going to really get us to that pretty ambitious goal of not only surveying all of the iguanas on the island and finally come up with a fairly detailed, reasonable estimate of how many we have and where are the big places that we find them, that's going to facilitate their conservation, that we can actually do a meaningful IUCN assessment of the red list status. Because I did it last year, or the year before, but I did it recently, and it was very difficult to write because we just don't have the data for so many things, and we need that data. So that's the one thing. And then ultimately, we're trying to develop this method that it can be used not just by us, but by the authorities out there. So the people who's normally actually monitoring as part of their work, because at the moment they're doing it in this, but they're also developing the use of drones, and we want to work with them to help them there. And we see our role as being able to sort of experiment and figure out the best way to do it. And they perhaps don't have the resources to do that, but the resources they have is being there, having the boats to go out. So if we can develop a good method for them that's as straightforward as possible and pass it along, like that would be great. And then they would ideally continue using these methods so that we continue to monitor the marine iguana, and we can really help to focus those resources where they're needed, sort of for the best protection of the species. And you mentioned that we are gathering data on other species too. So anything we can see in the images, we're basically trying to gather data on that, and not really for us, but perhaps for them, and maybe to facilitate other scientists who are working on this stuff. Like I said, we're very happy to facilitate other people's projects and work with others if we can help the conservation of other species as well. And one thing that came up there is the plastics, for instance. They are quite visible. And this season, we're even asking the volunteers to categorize those plastics. We've picked out a couple of categories, like stuff that looks related to fishing, because it's commonly stuff we see. Bottles is a big thing that you can often tell it's a bottle. And then there's sort of other. And that came out of talking with the Galapagos Conservation Trust, who have a big interest in oceanic plastics and projects they're working with. And we're just looking for, okay, what can we do to help other projects just in a kind of opportunistic way? If we're seeing stuff on the images, we're happy to work with others where it might help them to,
So I like what you're saying here, because really, whilst your core piece of scientific work is focusing on the marine iguanas and their protection, their understanding of their habitat, their behaviors, the spread, how they breed, and so on, you're also working with the local community, and you kind of, I guess, doing on the ground development work here, where you're a bit like a startup. You're using disruptive technology, because you haven't got any airspace regulations there, really. I guess certainly not like when I want to fly in the UK. So you can push boundaries in terms of height, probably not that useful because the pictures, need to be close enough, but certainly in terms of a distance and what you're going to do with that. So you can develop innovative approaches, and then you can share these with others, whether that's in sea observation, land observation, and then almost normalize it and train the local authorities and local science communities. And as part of that, I think you are working very close, and bringing this up here now again, you're working very closely with the Galapagos Conservation Trust. And I think it was actually one of their web pages where I first picked you up. Tell us a little bit more about your work with them and the opportunities I think you might be able to utilize through them, and by expanding your kind of work to other species and maybe other habitats, not just in the Galapagos, but globally as well.
Yeah, so a connection with the Galapagos Conservation Trust is quite old. They helped sponsor a project where we were looking at the impact of feral cats on marine iguanas back in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And this project kind of got handed to me as part of my PhD work. And so I was in contact with them, and I remained in contact with them. And they're wonderful for keeping, they keep a really good network. They know a lot of what's going on, so they can join people together where it's relevant and really facilitate science in that way. And they can sometimes give bits of funding here and there to maximize the potential for conservation on the islands through various scientific and conservation projects. So I don't know which is the more important role of them, perhaps the networking, but both are really helpful if you're doing a project like mine that fits in a kind of weird niche in terms of funding and stuff. So far we've had a lot of discussions of how might we be able to collaborate with other researchers on the Galapagos. But outside of that, I actually have not really got into that area very much yet. Because there is so much potential in the islands, and we spend a lot of our time discussing, okay, well, maybe we can do something for the plastics or for the understanding ray nurseries, and I think there's all kinds of other things we can do with it as well. But it's true, ultimately, there's potential for other places, certainly other archipelagos and islands. I think this drone method could be really useful for coastal monitoring of all kinds of species. And when we get to the end of this project, we hope to have published in the peer-reviewed literature with protocols about how other people might do this kind of monitoring from a drone, as well as making the protocols for the local authorities and training them and working with them to kind of ensure that this continues on the islands, because I think it will hopefully facilitate their work, but it can also have the potential of keeping their people a bit safer from those boat landings, which for me is like a big win, because it's a real challenge, that kind of stuff.
So there is, I guess, additional benefits, and one area we haven't covered yet, but I think you talk at your webpage a little bit also about machine learning. Now, when I looked at some of these pictures to classify iguanas, I found it quite challenging. And this is with human intelligence, with human eye. Okay, I'm getting a little bit older. My eyesight isn't that good anymore, maybe as well, but you can zoom in. But of course, there's other things like, for instance, we can see here some of these red crabs. They're pretty visible, and an algorithm should easily be able to pick them up. Same, I guess, for bigger objects, bigger animals in that case, like sea lions and maybe also birds. I've seen some comments of people who have been classifying. They even identified a bird nesting in shrubs. So if they can do it, there's a good chance AI might be able to do it. Now, I don't know how much AI and deep learning you're using already, but if someone in the science community or through the universities or whoever is going to watch this would see us and think, this is a fantastic project, I have got an AI tool that could assist with that, maybe with a little bit tweaking, customizing, what's the kind of things you would be looking for, and how can people who are seeing this or watching this, whether they are coming from a company perspective or whether they're individuals and they want to jump on this Zooniverse project, how could they reach out to you? How can they help you? And what sort of, how do you envision this project to develop over the next few years? Because to me, this is really a long-term, very important project. It's not where you come in, do your work, write your paper, and then you say, ciao, you know. And I guess you have a passion developed and I guess a love for the marine iguanas. You want to make sure they are protected. They're unique animals. You said they can't be found anywhere else. I don't think there's any zoo globally that has been able to capture them and make sure successfully look after them. So this is a unique space, requires protection in terms of, how do we reduce pollution, plastic being one of them. But there must be ways of the kind of data you're harvesting, maybe even at the moment, just as a byproduct of your work, to deploy things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and make this world and the Galapagos a better and a healthier and a more sustainable place ultimately. So what's your thoughts on this?
So we do want to use machine learning. We're still kind of finding the right collaborators for that. That's been because it's kind of outside of our network. It's been a case of searching around. And I think because there's so many commercial applications for machine learning, it's sometimes difficult to get people interested when you can't offer any kind of benefit other than, hey, you're doing something nice for conservation. We don't have a budget to pay somebody, but we certainly do think there's a lot of potential in it, and I think it is a wonderful way for people with those skills to contribute in this field of conservation. So at the moment we are talking with one or two people who might be able to help us there, but we're still completely open to other ideas and what people might have envisaged as ways to approach this. It's outside of my field of expertise, so it's a bit hard for me to even know what's possible, actually. I mean, we've had a couple of people have said, it might be possible to, for instance, count whilst you're surfing, count with the information that's coming from the drone. And that would be incredible. It sounds like witchcraft to me, but more than one person has said it could be possible. So yeah, if people are curious and might be able to offer something, would be great to hear from you. We have contact page on the website, which is showing there. Thank you. So there's email addresses, there's contact through there, and that's one way to get in contact. We have our Zooniverse project. We're pretty contactable through there as well. We have message boards. So it's nice to have an exchange. Sometimes people have questions about the biology and stuff, and we're always happy to interact with that as well. And other ways that people can help is that, I mean, I did mention, we sit in a kind of odd position for funding. So funding has been a bottleneck. Boat time in Galapagos is really expensive, and we're trying to do a lot on a small budget. And we know we've been pretty successful with that. But every field season, we're still seeking funds for the next one. So any kind of sponsorship opportunities or charities that might want to help out, we'd love to hear about that. And aside from that, it's always helpful to kind of be known, to get out there. So we have social media pages, there are links on our website. And if people just want to follow to stay updated on what we're doing, to see when the next phase of the Zooniverse launches, we put sometimes photographs from our expeditions that are quite nice on there. So it's a nice place to stay in contact. And the more interest we have, the more possibilities we have potentially to sort of score some corporate sponsorship, maybe from, DJI. I've written to them, they didn't reply. But that kind of thing, is all helpful. Maybe when I've got 1,000 followers on our Instagram, they might reply to my email. I don't know. But that's that's where we are. And we're not experts in everything, and being a scientist these days, sometimes it's like, well, you have to be tweeting, you have to be doing your emails, and you have to also somehow be doing your analysis and writing your papers and supervising your students, and it becomes sometimes an impossible task. So if anybody wants to work with us on any of that stuff, we're all ears, you know.
Fantastic. I think that's a wonderful summary to conclude this interview. I said to you at the beginning already, what I'd like to do is I'd like to support your work in various ways. So one I'm classifying. I find this very relaxing at the moment, looking at some of these pictures and trying to classify what's on there. I'm a little bit more relaxed now that you said earlier, and you're normalizing this, and it is not my picture only that helps contributing to that data. So you're using big data analysis to making sure you're picking up the right things, and obviously there's some pattern analysis going on here as well. I will be sharing this course with some of the colleges and universities I work with. I will be very likely posting this also to my own LinkedIn community. I'm not so active on Facebook, but I know you have got a own Iguanas from Above Facebook page as well. If the Galapagos Conservation Trust and or your project would want to share the recording of this interview, then I'm very happy for them to do that, because I think the important thing is, apart from seeing all these lovely pictures, almost like a holiday video when we watch BBC Blue Planet, maybe not the scene with the snake and the iguanas. I think that was sort of a crucial moment that probably would have stuck with a lot of people. But also when we see on ITV, Martin Clune's documentary and others, it's actually very difficult and very different to see how it is on the ground. And I'm so grateful for you sharing your experiences with our viewers here. If they want to get in touch, I would encourage them to reach out to you to make sure they be able to support you. And maybe more importantly, I have a pretty wide-ranging AI community as well now, not just individuals in the AI space, developers, but also companies that are working on different kind of machine patterns, AI, algorithms, pattern detection, whatever that might come to mind. And I hope when they watch this interview, they will be inspired by your work, will combine what they are doing, and hopefully reach out to you directly and say, look, we saw this on the interview you gave a while ago with Marcus. We really want to help here. We have something we think that could work for you. You've got the pictures anyway, so it's not any additional work necessarily for you, but you could share that with them. They could run their pictures and your pictures through their algorithms and see what is doable. And technology is continuously evolving in this space. So I think the future is exciting. It's amazing to see the work that you're doing. Please pass on my regards also to all your team members. It's been lovely finding out about them, and I hope we might be able to continue this in the future and see what other technologies you've been able to deploy, and what other discoveries you made from a science perspective, because this must continue. It's very, very important. I can see how passionate you are about this, but it's just amazing to see what's going on here. So thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it, and for your interest and for your offers of, sort of helping take it forward. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Amazing. All the best. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.